Good evening. So welcome everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you at the Drawing Institute. My name is Edward Kopp. I'm Chief Curator here, and we're very pleased to welcome you for this presentation of this year's Menil Drawing Institute Pre-Doctoral Fellow. And a key component of the Drawing Institute's program is our fellowship program. And the goal is really to foster scholarship on drawing, the highest level, and to really engage scholars and the wider public in object-based conversations about the medium's history, its theory, and its criticism and its practice. And so we have three different kinds of fellowship here at the Drawing Institute. The Pre-Doctoral Fellowship, of which Michelle was this year's recipient, which really gives funding and a kind of supporting environment for about 9 months to a doctoral student working on the drawing medium. There's also the Menil Morgan Fellowship, which we share with the Morgan Library and Museum in New York, and which is aimed for scholars at with different degrees of experience. And then finally, the Drawing Institute Research Fellowship, which is really multidisciplinary and which can be used to bring here critics, poets, artists, art historians, conservators. So now some biographic notes about Michelle. And so again, she's our pre-doctoral fellow this year, and she's a PhD candidate at Yale University. She studies 20th century American art with particular interest in the politics of materiality, intermediality, and process. And her dissertation investigates how women artists and artists of color unsettle the traditional boundaries between printmaking and drawing in 5 sites of creative production from 1935 to 1975 in the United States. And this fall, she'll be the inaugural Helen Frankenthaler Foundation Pre-Doctoral Fellow at the Smithsonian Museum of American Art. And prior coming to joining Yale, Michelle was the inaugural Curatorial Fellow at the Sondra Gelman Study Center at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And there she curated a very interesting exhibition, which our colleagues at the Whitney still talk about. And the show was called Experiments in Electrostatics, Photocopy Art from the Whitney Collection, 1966-1986. And Michelle has also held curatorial positions at the Yale Center for British Arts, the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, the Morgan Library and Museum, the Guggenheim, and the Brooklyn Museum. She earned her MA in Art History from the University of Pennsylvania and her BA in Art History from Vassar College. And as a personal note, she's been an absolute delight to have around. She's very enthusiastic, as you'll see, very passionate. And also she's incredibly curious and diligent in pursuing endeavors. So, fasten your seatbelt, please. And before turning over to her, I'd like to quickly remind everyone to turn off your cell phones if you haven't already done that. And as always, this lecture is recorded and it will be made available on the Menil's YouTube channel in the coming weeks. And at the end, I presume that you will take some questions. Michelle? Yes? And so now please join me in welcoming Michelle Donnelly. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Is this a good height? Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. It's such a pleasure to see so many friends and colleagues in the audience, and I'm grateful to some family members for traveling here for this lecture. It's been such a pleasure to be here at the Menil for the past 9 months, and I want to express my tremendous gratitude to everyone here, especially the MDI team, for being so generous and kind during my fellowship. So thank you especially to Edward and for that very kind introduction. Thank you also to Kirsten, Constance, Kelly, Jan, Patrick, Catherine, Dominic, Aurelie, and Seneca for making this such a wonderful year. So I want to begin my talk with this work by Mona Hatoum. We see a series of graphite markings that extend in a variety of directions. They crisscross and overlap with a sense of frenetic energy, forming a rectangular mass in the center of the composition. Within this mass, a pattern of hexagon shapes emerges, which are defined by the absence of graphite. At first glance, the composition may seem to resemble a wall barrier or a wire fence, but in fact, it represents the ground. Hatoum placed a sheet of paper over the floor and then rapidly moved a pencil across it. From the pressure of the artist's hand and the counter pressure of the ground, the raised areas of the floor tiles registered in positive on the sheet through the graphite markings, and the joints between the tiles registered in negative through the reserve of the paper. Fundamentally, this drawing documents the physical conditions of a tiled surface, but it's also a record of Hatoum's bodily presence in a place that she had a connection to. She created this rubbing not on any floor, but on the bathroom floor of the Menil bungalow that she was staying in called Wee House. It's just around the corner from here and only 1 block away from the Menil bungalow that I've been living in this year. Because of my connection to the Menil's campus, I was particularly interested in seeing where Hatoum made this rubbing. But this was more complicated than I anticipated. I assumed that she made it in the place that we currently call Wee House, and thanks to Natalie, I learned that this is the second iteration of Wee House, and Hatoum actually stayed in original Wee House. So thanks to Constance and to Jack, I finally got access to original Wee House this week, and I saw where Hatoum made this rubbing. As the title indicates, she made it on April 23rd, 2017, during her residency at the Moody, and while she was preparing for her 2017 retrospective at the Menil. While the title marks her relationship to this place at a particular moment in time, Wee House also has a deeper history. It's hosted countless other artists, visiting scholars, and Houstonians since the early 20th century and since the de Menils acquired it. It even used to house Dominique de Menil's library. So when we think about the rubbing in relation to the place in which it was made, it becomes not just an abstract composition, but opens up these larger questions about homemaking, domestic labor, spatial access, and embedded memory. And these are questions that are central to my dissertation. My project investigates how artists unsettled the conventional boundaries between drawing and printmaking in 5 alternative sites of creative production from 1935 to 1975 in the United States. Most research on printmaking has focused on edition prints made on presses and other specialized equipment in a workshop setting, often with the help of a professional printer. But many artists didn't have access to these kinds of spaces, especially women artists and artists of color. So they had to make do with the tools and materials that were available to them in the spaces they did have access to. And they gravitated towards manual techniques that relied on contact, pressure, and transfer to create unique impressions on paper. The 5 chapters of my project consider how Ruth Asawa turned to stamping in the space of her home. David Hammonds made body prints in the space of his studio, which was a former dance hall. Shari Deans created rubbings along the banks of the Columbia River. Matsu Saburo Hibi hand-pulled relief prints in a World War II Japanese-American incarceration camp. And Caroline Durier invented radioactive ink in a nuclear research center. My talk today will be guided by a key line of inquiry from my research. How do artworks gain meaning in the context of their sites of production? I'll be placing a selection of objects by 2 artists from my dissertation in dialogue with works from the Menil's collection that have helped me think through questions of place in the expanded field of drawing. So essentially, I'll be asking, what do these works reveal about the spaces they were made in, and what do the spaces they were made in reveal about these works? My talk will also take seriously drawings as material objects, and I'll give significant attention to artists' tools, supports, and processes of making. In particular, I'll address how artists used rubbing, stamping, pricking, contour drawing, and body printing to engage with the histories, the communities, and the politics of the sites that they were working in. So let's turn to an artist that many of us in Houston have become quite familiar with this spring, thanks to the wonderful exhibition that Edward and Kim have co-curated at the MDI. This is a stamp work by Ruth Asawa, and there are actually 3 examples of works from this series on view in the galleries, though this particular work is not on view. Here, Asawa is repeatedly hand stamping the words double sheet in 5 zigzagging formations down a page for the New York Times classified ads. And she would have used a tool similar to this. This is a custom-made rubber stamp that my colleague Ben Levy had made for me using the font from Double Sheet. So with this kind of tool, Asawa would have carefully worked down the sheet from top to bottom and left to right, carefully placing each impression just below the last. And then on the left side of the page, 2 intriguing phrases peek through these stampings from the newspaper page below. Artist home with studio and charming mountain summer home. Together, these back-to-back real estate listings evoke the place where Asawa made this work. Black Mountain College, which was an experimental liberal arts school in rural North Carolina. Asawa had moved to Black Mountain in the summer of 1946, and she said that at the school, quote, there was no separation of art and living. She and her fellow students lived in rustic lodges on campus, and they each had their own studio in the studies building, which you see on the left. Everyone on campus was also expected to participate in the community work program. To make Black Mountain a successful experiment in community living, students and faculty were asked to contribute 10 to 12 hours per week toward the operation and maintenance of the campus. Over her 3 years at Black Mountain, Asawa assisted on the farm by planting crops, driving the tractor, churning butter. She also worked in the dining hall, mopping floors and clearing tables, and she even volunteered as the campus barber, cutting people's hair. Then in the summer of 1948, the summer before her last year as a student, she became in charge of washing and preparing the bed linens for guest faculty, including the de Koonings who were there that summer. In the laundry room, she encountered the double sheet stamp that she would use to create this work. And this stamp was typically used by laundry workers to mark the edges of bed sheets. Once the sheets were folded, it was difficult to tell what was for a single bed and what was for a double bed. So the double sheet stamp facilitated sorting by identifying the size of the bed linen. And this is another stamp work, which is on view in the exhibition, that uses a different laundry stamp. This one says BMC, which stands for Black Mountain College. Asawa brought these rubber stamps back to her campus studio, and she created at least 15 works that explore their aesthetic and conceptual possibilities. She repeatedly pressed them onto paper and fabric, building a wide variety of compositions. On the left, she created a chevron pattern that plays with figure and ground. On the right, she crafted a sunburst that optically suggests rotational movement. I argue, though, that these works are not just exercises in formalist abstraction. They make visible the labor that was required to sustain Black Mountain. All campus chores had to be continuously performed, whether daily, weekly, or seasonally. For instance, tables had to be cleared after every meal, coal had to be hauled up Blue Ridge Mountain throughout the fall and the winter to heat the furnace, crops had to be planted semi-annually to feed the campus, and laundry needed to be regularly washed, dried, and folded. So, imprinted with a tool from her own labor, Asawa's laundry stamp prints evoke the rounds, the rotations, the sequences, and the cycles of chores that served her campus community. And the BMC pattern on the right particularly conveys a sense of cyclicality. She started this form in the center and expanded it outward, stamping and rotating in a clockwise motion. After each impression, she replenished her stamp with ink to regenerate the college's initials, materializing and rematerializing the relationship with Black Mountain. In another work, Asawa pressed the BMC stamp thousands of times on a torn bedsheet. So she essentially took the sheet that she was responsible for laundering and she turned it into a receptive artistic surface. And I can only imagine the diligence required to create this work. She must have had intense focus to ignore the tiring of her arm and move her body in a coordinated rhythm, inking and stamping until the entire sheet was filled. And through her choice of support and tool, these meticulous stampings place her labor as an artist in dialogue with her labor as an artist in dialogue with her labor as a launderer. Earlier in the 20th century, laundry was a physically demanding chore that wore at workers' backs, shoulders, and knees. Then with the rise of the electric washing machine in the 1920s, the burden shifted from hand scrubbing to sorting, loading, and unloading. And although it was hailed as a labor-saving device, the washing machine did not save labor, it merely altered it. A higher standard of cleanliness emerged, and this resulted in a higher volume of textiles that needed to be more frequently sorted, loaded, and unloaded. So Asawa's return of the laundry stamp to the bedsheet, again and again and again, evokes the monotony of laundering a bedsheet again and again and again. But I think it's also important to note that the laundry stamp held sociocultural associations beyond Black Mountain. Laundry work was historically performed by women of color who worked as housekeepers and day cleaners in other people's homes, as launderers in commercial facilities, and as launderers in their own homes working for clients. And Asawa had direct experience with this kind of labor. Before Black Mountain, she worked as a paid housekeeper while living in Milwaukee for 3 years. So her stamped impressions express not only the repetitiveness of laundry work, but they also make visible the often unseen labor that women of color historically performed. Asawa's stamp works call to mind this drawing by Zarina in the MDI's collection. Zarina took a sheet of laminated paper and repeatedly pierced it with a sewing needle. She poked the sheet from behind, again and again and again, creating a topography of tiny pinholes on the front. This work is also incredibly difficult to photograph, so I'm especially grateful to Kirsten and Patrick for helping me see it in person this year. Similar to Asawa's stamp works, repetition is the guiding principle. I've tried to count the pinholes, and I've estimated that there are 9,300 of them, but don't quote me on that. Zarina did not make this, though, in a space of communal living like Asawa. She made it in the space of her own home. Historically, the domestic sphere has been associated with gendered labor, in which women are responsible for cleaning and maintaining household surfaces. And second wave feminists frequently described the cycle of domestic chores as a never-ending burden. Simone de Beauvoir wrote, quote, "Few tasks are more like the torture of Sisyphus than housework, with its endless repetition. The clean becomes soiled, the soiled is made clean, over and over, day after day." The Greek myth of Sisyphus that de Beauvoir references is about a man condemned to push a boulder up a mountain only to have it roll back down as he neared the summit. And she framed the task of maintaining domestic surfaces as similarly futile. This work by Zarina was made using a gendered domestic tool traditionally wielded by women to mend and repair textiles. Zarina, however, used it to wound a sheet of paper. In the context of the gender politics of the home, we might interpret these repeated punctures as expressions of the tedium and the stress of domestic labor, of women's work that is never done. But we also might consider this work in relation to Zarina's own home life. She's described the period in which she's made her pinhole drawings as extremely difficult. Her husband suddenly passed away in 1977, and she recalled in her memoir, quote, "I never wanted to leave my house. I felt eaten away. I took needle to paper and pierced it repeatedly. For months I stayed home, made my pin drawings, and thought about my life." Her comments suggest that her piercing of the paper was a way of working through her grief in the home that she had built with her husband. So whether contending with the conditions of gendered labor or grappling with a lost idea of home, Zarina's drawing actively responded to her domestic environment. After graduating from Black Mountain, Isawa also created art in the space of her home. In 1949, she married fellow Black Mountain student Albert Lanier, and together they moved to San Francisco and ultimately raised 6 children. In their home on Alpine Street, Isawa continued to explore stamping as a mode of artistic expression. And she created the work that you see on the screen, and which is on view in the exhibition, by transforming a potato from her kitchen into a homemade stamp. She sliced the potato in half and carved a pattern of abstract forms into its face. Then she applied blue ink to the carved surface and repeatedly pressed it in 3 undulating rows. Because she only inked the blue once, each impression became less and less saturated as she continued stamping. Then she did the same process with purple ink, creating a rhythmic composition that wavers in translucency and opacity. Isawa's use of a material from her kitchen recalls Hatum's rubbing that we looked at earlier. Here, Hatum repurposed parchment paper from Wee House's kitchen. Parchment paper is typically used for cooking, either to cover the surface of a baking sheet or to wrap food as it cooks in the oven. And Hatum chose to use this readily available material instead of going out and buying drawing paper. On the one hand, this was a pragmatic decision. It saved her time and money. But on the other, it was a conceptual move. By embracing a paper with domestic associations, she repositioned the feminine realm of the kitchen as a site of artistic experimentation. And Isawa similarly found aesthetic potential in everyday items from her kitchen. In addition to potatoes, she made dozens of stamped prints using apples and wine corks. And there's even a print in the exhibition using bike pedals, so perhaps we can expand this site to include the garage as well. Significantly, Isawa created this large body of stamp works while she was raising 3 children. Many women artists at mid-century faced pressure to pause their careers until their children were grown. But Isawa tried to actively integrate art making and caretaking. Instead of setting up a separate studio, she made art across the rooms of her home. Isawa's close friend, Imogen Cunningham, captured the dynamics of her household in this now iconic photograph from 1957. We see Isawa on the right constructing a looped wire sculpture alongside 4 of her children in their home on Saturn Street. So this was taken in a different house a few years after she completed the stamp works, but I think that this kind of expresses the domestic environment that she cultivated. We see Isawa crouched on the ground with her head down in intense concentration. Next to her, her infant Adam drinks from a bottle. Beside her, her daughter Aiko holds a wooden dowel, which is a tool for winding wire, and suggests that she is at work helping her mother with her art making. At left, her son Hudson squats on a table looking at pictures. And in the back of the room, through the sculpture, we see her oldest child, Xavier, quietly observing the scene. This photograph demonstrates how Isawa attempted to navigate her dual roles as parent and artist under a single roof. She didn't sequester her artistic practice, but actively involved her children in her endeavors. And while she invited them to make art alongside her, She also expected them to contribute to the household by ironing, folding laundry, cleaning tables, washing dishes, taking out the trash, and performing other chores. So it was in this kind of domestic environment that Asawa created her large body of food stamp prints. Stamping really suited the dynamics of her domestic practice. Stamps were lightweight and compact, and they could easily move from room to room wherever her responsibilities took her. The process of stamping was also adaptable to the unpredictable rhythms of caretaking. Asawa could easily start, stop, and start again as she attended to the needs of her children. While making this print, for instance, she could have put down the potato to do a task that required her attention, like load the laundry, clean a spill, or change a diaper, and then picked the potato back up and resumed. Because of her divided attention as a parent, Asawa typically built an artwork in pieces over time rather than in a single sitting. She advised other mothers, quote, "It's important to learn how to use your small bits of time, your 5 minutes, your 10 minutes, your 15 minutes. All those begin to count up. You should learn how to use your snatches of time when they are given to you." And stamping could easily be done during these snatches of time, and it was safe for her to perform in the company of her children. Potatoes and apples posed no risk to curious fingers. They could be handled, even accidentally ingested, without causing any harm to their bodies, perhaps with the exception of the wine corks and the bike pedals. But I find it meaningful that Asawa gravitated towards materials that were not simply non-toxic, but nourishing. And the designs of her homemade stamps even suggest a sense of growth. The forms she carved into her potato here resemble a growth pattern, like the branches of a tree, the roots of a plant, or the veins of a leaf. Their wavering repetition across the sheet further evokes a sense of development, growth, and regeneration. So in these ways, both materially and visually, Asawa's stamp prints embody the care and the nurturance that she cultivated in her household. So let's move from the Bay Area to another site of artistic production in California. We're going to take a look at David Hammons' studio in Los Angeles. In the 1970s, Hammons created a series of unique works on paper in which he transformed his body into a hybrid printing plate and drawing tool. In these photographs by his friend Bruce W. Talaman that were taken at his studio, we see Hammons lubricating his skin, hair, and jeans with baby oil. Then he presses himself onto paper placed on the floor. His palms are pushing firmly against the ground with his hips high and his thighs tense, and he strains to touch the right side of his forehead to the blank sheet of paper. Another photograph reveals a later stage of this process. Hammons awkwardly balances himself on the toes of his sneakers to leave an impression of his right arm in the middle of the paper. Although he seems to be struggling to maneuver his body, he explained the importance of a floor-bound orientation in the 1971 interview. According to Hammons, when he wanted a lighter, more subtle impression, he set the paper against the wall because an upright position gave him more control over the application of pressure. But when he wanted a more saturated impression, he placed the paper on the floor, creating the image in collaboration with gravity. Finally, Hammons sifted charcoal or powdered pigment through a strainer over his work in progress. This mist of color would cling to the grease, making his impressions more boldly legible. And these are just a few works that he made using this technique. And I think we especially get a sense of the significance of the floor in the print in the center, in which he rolled his torso across the paper to create this distorted bodily form. Hammons was not alone in turning to the floor of his studio as a productive artistic surface. This is a rubbing in the MDI's collection that Jack Whitten made in his studio in New York. Whitten's process of making this work was essentially the same as Mona Hatoum's. He placed a sheet of paper on the ground and then pressed a carbon stick against it. The 3 horizontal lines that you see in negative were created by the spaces between the floorboards, similar to the joints between the bathroom tiles in Hachum's work. By moving the carbon stick across the sheet, Whitten captured the rough texture of the wood beneath, as well as the detritus of his studio. And one of my favorite details is the cluster of staples that appear on the right side of the paper. Hammonds's move to the floor was also characteristic of his artistic practice at this time. He was developing innovative ways of making paintings, and he built a massive drawing board into his floor. He would unroll his canvases on top of this board and then pull tools like rakes, hair combs, and sheet metal across. So this rubbing captures that shift in orientation from the easel to the ground that was driving his artistic experimentation. At the same time, the work bears a direct physical connection to his site of production. And Hammonds's body prints were similarly connected to his studio. But his space had a particularly unique history. If we examine the background of Talemann's photograph, we see that he worked in an impressive architectural setting with high ceilings and wooden floors. And if we look just above his shoulder, we can even make out a raised stage. From archival research, I've learned that his studio was the site of a former dance hall called the West Slauson Ballroom. It was built in 1925 and operated for over 30 years. In the 1950s, this ballroom hosted dances for Black social clubs, like the Dreamer Social Club. The tradition of social clubs had started on the East Coast and made its way to Los Angeles at the turn of the 20th century. They were separated by gender, and they provided opportunities for middle and upper class Black folks to build camaraderie through dinners, fundraisers, weekend retreats, and annual balls. Here, we see the executive members of the Dreamers Social Club dressed for a black tie New Year's Eve dance at the West Slauson Ballroom in 1958. And although it was an all-male club, the dance would have been open to their whole families. So along with their partners and their children, they would have had the chance to meet, mingle, and dance to a live band, forging a sense of community and belonging in a segregated and racist city. So how might we consider Hammonds's body printing practice in the context of this history of his studio? To think through this question, I want to turn to a body print that Hammonds made with his former wife, Becky. In his early years of making body prints, Hammonds exclusively used his own body, as we saw before. But around 1970, he started to incorporate other people into his prints, and he produced a substantial number of these duetted works. Here, we see his and Becky's bodies intertwined, with each of them wearing an elaborate robe. On the right, Becky tilts her head up toward him as she lays her hand on his shoulder. His right arm crosses over her left to caress her shoulder in return. And this scene of mutual touch required Hammonds's coordination of their bodies in the process of making. He explained in a 1971 interview, quote, "When I lie down on the paper, I have to carefully decide how to get up after I've made the impression that I want. Sometimes I lie there for perhaps 3 minutes or even longer, just figuring out how I can get off the paper without smudging the image that I'm trying to print." So each of his movements with Becky had to be carefully considered in order to leave their impressions intact and to achieve the composition that he envisioned. And the strategic choreography was similar to the partner dancing that once took place in his studio. Hammonds essentially assumed the role of lead, and Becky assumed the role of follow. Through touch, he guided their bodies to the paper. He pressed their weight against the surfaces of the walls and the floors to generate their imagery, similar to how dancers use counter-pressure from the ground to achieve their movements. By working together, he and Becky would also have been able to hold tense or off-balance positions that would have been too difficult to do on their own. To create the work on the screen, Hammonds likely made the impression of his face first. Then he would have placed Becky's face, arm, and hand next to his imprint. And we see that he focused pressure on her upper body, making a dense imprint of her arm through the lace fabric. Next, he pulled her away from the paper and responded to her impression, placing the outside of his hand on just the edge of her cheek. It would have taken a great deal of precision, strength, and balance to do this without disrupting the rest of her impression. So through synchronized touch and release, Hammonds was able to create this double body print in collaboration with his former wife. Hammonds' choreographed movements recall two drawings by Trisha Brown in the MGI's collection. Brown was a choreographer and a dancer who founded the Trisha Brown Dance Company in 1970. And she created a large body of works on paper over 4 decades that engage with the body in space. She said in an interview, quote, "I do the same thing in drawing as I do in dance. I'm not sure which came first." The drawing that you see on the left might look like a simple contour drawing of a pair of feet, but Brown created it by posing a challenge to herself. Instead of making the drawing with a pencil in her hand, she used each foot to draw the other. She sat on the ground and placed a pencil between the toes of her right foot and drew her left foot while observing it. Then she moved the pencil to her left foot and drew her right. When I first learned this, I assumed that the sheet of paper was propped up against an easel on the floor, but the paper was actually down on the ground with her, on the level of the dance floor, like Hammonds' body prints. Drawing each foot would have required Brown to activate her muscles and balance her body in a way that relied on her experience as a dancer. And I also love the way the line in this drawing subtly vibrates as though it's responding to minute changes from her heart beating or from breathing. In these ways, the work suggests an expanded notion of dance in which movement can originate anywhere in the body. Brown then made the drawing that you see on the right several decades later during a private performance in her studio. She placed sheets of paper on the floor and danced on top of them, treating the paper like a stage. Her footprints at the top of the sheet were made by directly standing on the paper and then dragging her feet downward. If you look closely, you can see multiple impressions of her toes, footbed, and heel. Then Brown used her feet to drag sticks of charcoal down the paper, creating these sinuous, stuttering bands. These marks simultaneously document the movement of her body and capture the texture of the studio floor. And Hammonds' body prints similarly mark the relationship of the body to its environment, an environment that was charged with a history of dance. Like the ballroom dancers who pressed their bodies together in unison in previous decades in his studio, Hammonds relied on touch and bodily coordination to create these intimate impressions. One more artist I want to bring in from the Menil's collection to help us think through Hammonds is Jasper Johns. This is a lithograph that Johns created at the workshop ULAE in collaboration with printer Ben Burns. And it's based on a series of drawings that he made in his studio in Edisto Beach, South Carolina. Johns created this work by covering his face, hair, and hands with a greasy substance called tuche. Then he rolled his face and pressed his hands on a lithographic stone. Finally, under the pressure of the printing press, the stone transferred his impression onto engineer's paper. Art historian Jennifer Roberts has described this process as inherently alienating. The press displaced the artist's once direct mark onto another surface. And she argues that rather than signifying the artist's presence, the traces of Johns' body in the final print signify estrangement. And I think the sense of estrangement also comes through in Johns' imagery. We see his face pressed against the surface of the picture plane with his hands raised in a defensive gesture. He is not reaching out in connection, but seems trapped behind a frame. So the distancing of Johns' body from his final print helps us better understand the directness of Hammonds's printing method. To create the work on the screen, Hammonds pressed his and Becky's skin and hair to the paper without intervention. This unmediated contact allowed him to capture an incredible range of detail. When you see his body prints in person, you're able to make out individual strands of hair, individual pores, wrinkles. One time I even found goosebumps in one of his prints. They're really incredible to see in person. As records of bodily engagement, Hammonds's prints were called a history of contact relics. A contact relic is an object believed to carry the sacred power of a holy person as the result of direct touch. An example is the veil of Veronica. According to legend, when Saint Veronica wiped the face of Christ on the way to his crucifixion, a miraculous image of his face was transferred onto her cloth. In this embroidered work in the Menil's collection, we see Saint Veronica, Saint Peter, and Saint Paul holding that cloth, which was believed to transmit healing powers to those who touched it. Pilgrims traveled to St. Peter's Basilica throughout the medieval period in pursuit of the miraculous powers of this contact relic. And Hammond similarly understood touch as a potent act of transfer. When discussing his use of black hair as a medium, he exclaimed, quote, "You've got tons of people's spirits in your hands when you work with that stuff. The same with wine bottles. A black person's lips have touched each one." From Hammonds's perspective, a material that once had a connection to the body harbored that person's spirit. And because of his own reference to lips, I want to quickly bring in these two body prints in which a kiss directly materializes. On the left, a figure purses his lips in the direction of the viewer. On the right, Hammond bestows a kiss onto a woman whose own lips brush against her palm. To produce these images, Hammonds and his partners had to quite literally kiss the paper. As in all of his body prints, no intermediary surface came between the body and the sheet. They were made through direct contact and became vessels for human energies. To take this one step further, when Hammonds and his printing partners placed their lips, their hair, their hands, their torsos onto the paper, they also pressed against the floors and the walls of his studio, floors and walls that had been danced upon and leaned against by ballroom patrons over 3 decades. If we apply Hammonds's own understanding of receptive surfaces to his studio's architecture, we can interpret his prints as activating and absorbing the site's embedded memories. And so through these acts of touch, Hammonds and his collaborators forged intimate connections across time with those who once occupied the space of his studio. To conclude, I'd like to return to Mona Hatoum. With questions of place and creative production on my mind this week, I decided to make my own rubbing on the bathroom floor of Wee House. I brought a sheet of parchment paper from my Menil bungalow, and I moved a graphite pencil across it, making contact with the same surface that Hatoum had. This experience led me to wonder, how did Hatoum use drawing to ground herself to place? What histories did she bring to the surface when she made this work? What relationships at the Menil and in Houston was she marking by pressing her pencil to the floor? How did she mark this place, and how did this place mark her? Hatoum's rubbing asks us to reorient our perspective, to pay attention to the quotidian materials that surround us, and to find aesthetic potential in even the most mundane of surfaces. Her rubbing encourages us to see our daily environments as worthy of artistic investigation and to document each of our homes, no matter how transitory. Thank you.
So I have a mic. If you raise your hand, bring it up.
Thank you very much. Did you study with Edward? He's the teacher, professor at Yale.
Edward Cook?
Yes.
Yes, he's on my dissertation committee. He's wonderful. And he was just in Houston recently.
Yes, and that's where I've heard there's some similar inspiration, I would say. Thank you.
Hi, I'd just like to hear more about what you were saying about different artists whose techniques leave no space, or that the contact is unmediated in some way. And I'm curious to hear you expand on that a bit.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that question?
I'll unmask, yes. I'm interested in when you were talking about the techniques that lead to a kind of unmediated contact or an extra intimate contact, and I'm curious about hearing more about those qualities.
Yeah, so I think when we think of body prints, usually it's from someone covering their body in an inky substance and then pressing it to paper. And most often it's through the use of a printing press. So like with John's, he pressed it to a lithographic stone and then the press displaced that mark onto another surface. And Hammond's process is so unique because he's using grease and baby oil as his substance to impress himself onto paper. And so because of the sensitivity of that, we're able to capture all this incredible detail. So I'm interested in how direct contact can relate to this idea of contact relics because of how connections can be forged across time and how this is a process, or not a process, this is an idea that Hammond himself has expressed, how the body can harbor an energy. So what does it mean to make direct contact with someone? What does it mean to do it with a printing partner and not just oneself in the space of a studio? And how can we extend this idea of a contact relic to the floors and to the walls that he's working on that have also made direct contact with bodies over time? So it's something that I'm definitely still thinking through, but the notion of touch is definitely central to my interpretation of Hammond's work.
Thank you. The concept of finger painting we often dismiss as juvenilia, and now I'm wondering why.
That is a great question, and I feel like that is a question that my project is grappling with, that a lot of these processes are processes that haven't been taken seriously by scholars or museum collections because they kind of fall through the cracks of how we think of what a print is or what a drawing is. And so something like a body print made with baby oil is not a fine art substance. It was not additioned. It was not made with the help of a professional printer. It was made in his studio. And Hammond's works have received a great deal of attention, so I'm not, I guess, specifically talking about his works falling through the cracks of collections, but I think you're right that we should take finger painting more seriously, and we should take processes that aren't made in a professional workshop setting seriously and thinking about why people are turning to the materials that they have among them and how can they creatively use them.
Thank you for the great talk. It also seems like the body prints aren't, in a traditional sense, mechanically reproduced, which kind of makes them, I think about an aura and Walter Benjamin. And I was wondering if that's, especially in this time period, if that factored into your research and thoughts on the body prints.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question because Hammond's used screen printing for some of his body prints, which I didn't talk about today. So he is using a process of mechanical reproduction, but all of his prints are unique. None of them are reproducible, none of them are additioned. They're all irreproducible images on paper. So I think you're right. It does kind of engage with this notion of the aura as the unique work of art. And at the same time, because it's these unique, non-additioned objects, I think sometimes those works are taken less seriously. So there's kind of this push and pull between what the aura is able to bestow onto an object, and also how sometimes museum collections don't take those kinds of works as seriously.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. I had another question about Hammond's body prints. I'm curious, if I'm not mistaken, I think he moved to New York around 74, if that's right. And so I'm wondering, the one Kiss print from 76, I think, like how does his process change, and have you noticed that him responding differently to his new site in New York versus LA, or just if you've explored his relationship to, sorry.
No, finish your question.
Just how much you anchored it in the site of production in LA, if you're noticing a similar connection.
Yeah, this is a great question because no one can say definitively when Hammond's moved to New York, and I also can't say definitively how long he had this studio. I've checked building records in Los Angeles, and I can't find a record of his lease agreement. So I don't know the exact years that he's in Los Angeles, but based on the great work that was done for the Drawing Center's exhibition, they determined that he actually was working in Los Angeles through 1980. And so, or actually, I think I'm getting confused. I think it's 1977. So he starts moving to New York, but also still coming back to his Los Angeles studio, and he's letting Senga Nengudi use it. So there's still art making happening in this space. And as Senga Nengudi is using it, she is also allowing him to come back into this space. And a collective called Studio Z also starts doing performance pieces there, and he's involved with Studio Z. So it's a big question mark about how long is he in this physical space for? And from my understanding, he seems to stop making the body prints once he permanently moves to New York, which is no later than 1980, but could be as early as 1977. And another really interesting part of his practice that I didn't get the chance to talk to today, but is part of my larger dissertation chapter, is he hosts body printing events in other spaces in New York and Los Angeles. So he hosts an event in the apartment of Suzanne Jackson, who's in the Asawa exhibition. Asawa drew her portrait in one of her sketchbooks, so I recommend checking that out. And so he did a body printing event there to help raise money for the gallery Jam. And then he does a second one at Philip Yenewine's apartment in New York, also to raise money for Jam. So I can't say definitively which prints were made in his studio and which prints were made at these body printing events and which prints were made maybe in New York. Like who really knows? Maybe he did continue making them in New York. But I think what Hammonds invites us to think about is his studio as a lens onto his practice. He's someone who was very thoughtful about how his work was being documented. And I don't think it's a coincidence that he's asking his friend to photograph him doing this process in his studio. And these are the most famous reproduced works of this process. So I think that, what does it mean to look at this through the frame of dance, and what does it mean to think of him engaging with these histories, even if we can't make a direct one-to-one connection from one print to another?
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Michelle. And I was interested in the idea of the contact relic, and also of the way you're talking about receptive surfaces, and let's say with David Hammond's, thinking about the skin and the body as a receptive surface, the paper as a receptive surface, and then these two receptive bodies coming together, and perhaps the body and the substrate or the material that gets engaged with, all of that being an example of types of contact relics, that the body itself is a contact relic. And I'm just thinking about those things in relation to what you were, to your talk, and I wondered what you think about that. Is that going too far, or how do you
This is a great
draw
question. This is definitely something I have to keep thinking through, but I love that idea of the body itself as an absorptive surface, that the body and you are being marked from this experience. And in the larger part of my dissertation, I talk about because I focus on these collaborative body prints, which haven't received as much attention, and I think about how they're forging kinship through their processes of making. So thinking about how you're forging connections and relationships through touch. So maybe that's a way to think about how we're marked by this process, by these relationships that come out of the process.
Thank you, Michelle. I have a couple of questions. The first one is, how did you narrow in on this modality to deliver your dissertation? And the second one is, I'm gathering a sense of childlike play that in the beginning, whenever you were talking about the artist who had her children part of that, you talked about that domestication, and then at the end, you were on the floor, and I thought, what a playful moment as coming together. And did anything come up for you from your childhood? And what was that like, and how did that influence the process?
I love this question. So just to clarify, when you're asking about the modality of my dissertation, do you mean how did I come to the case studies for the project? Yes. Yeah, so the way that this project came about, I mean, Edward mentioned this exhibition that I curated at the Whitney called Experiments in Electrostatics, in which I looked at artists who used the photocopier as a hybrid camera printing press. And many of these artists turned to the photocopier because they didn't have access to a printing press, and they didn't have access to a darkroom. And so that kind of like spurred these questions for me, is like, what does it mean when artists can't access the spaces that we take seriously as artistic spaces? And it's hard to say how I even came across these case studies anymore, but the way that I narrowed in on them, I was interested in having 5 different kinds of sites. The 2 options were I could do a whole project on women working in the home, which was definitely a dissertation topic. There's so many women working in the home. And then what I decided to gravitate towards, though, was kind of this sampling of spaces. And I was particularly interested in artists whose work, I think, richly engaged with the site itself, how site becomes part of the work. And so that's how I narrowed in on it. And I should also just add as a fun note, the way that I came to Ruth Asawa is because I was working with Kim Connedy, who was Edward's co-curator at the Whitney when she acquired that potato print. And so that potato print was so interesting to me and really stayed with me over the years. So it's really nice to be able to live with that print again here at the Menil. And then with your question about play, that's a really good question. For me, I used to be an artist. I used to think I was going to be a studio major in college, and then I got really obsessed with art history, and I feel like my creativity shifted into this intellectual creativity, but that hands-on making is still so fun to me and so satisfying. So actually, my colleague who made this stamp for me, we did a 2-week program at Harvard called the Summer Institute for Technical Studies and Art for Art Historians, where we just made art for 2 weeks, and it was fabulous. And after that program, I realized I wanted to more actively bring art making as a mode of thinking for my art historical practice. So yes, going to make the rubbing definitely activated some of that deep joy of making. And it's interesting what you're saying about childhood, like that textural experience of like touching the pencil to the floor, like you have that memory of that, and something like comes through there. So yes, that was very fun, and honestly, I want to keep making rubbings on floors. It was a delight. And one more thing that I should add is that last year's fellow, Isabel Bird, she has this practice where she makes at least 1 drawing a day, and I really loved that about her way of thinking through drawing. So I want to try to more actively bring drawing into my everyday living and thinking.
Thank you so much, Michelle.
Thank you.